I really appreciate the kind introduction. I have to be honest, make sure I don't knock over one of these tables. I have to be honest, I mean, the real folks that are driving the blockchain discussion is everybody in this room. And I wouldn't have been able to take the risk that we were lucky enough to take if you guys didn't start kind of working together on the primer and the playbook, which you're going to hear about later. Because when industry believes in something, it makes it easier for a leader in government to take a risk. So I have to thank you all. And just for Gene, thank you so much for doing that work. They asked for a bio, and I told them, like, I mean, they'll write a biography when I die. So I actually refused to send it. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. And real briefly, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So I've asked Tony Scott. Tony Scott, as you all know, is former federal CIO. He's been kind of working in the private sector for a bit of time. The reason that I asked Tony to come on this panel, guys, is the idea to operate off the data layer and the idea to actually build microservices off the data layer, the initial thought that that is possible, actually came from an industry engagement where Tony Scott started talking about, you know, if you're going to design a city from scratch, how would you design it? And now I believe we don't have the technological constraints that we've historically had. We actually have the ability to do that. So Tony, if you could come on up. My second panelist, go ahead. The second person that I've asked to kind of join us today is an innovator from Deloitte. And what's interesting about Mark, and I did not know this, it's Mark White from Deloitte, their Chief Technology Officer. What's interesting about Mark is that they've done over 100 different proofs of concepts around the world as it relates to blockchain technology, machine learning, and operating off the data layer. And I learned that the last time we had a panel discussion. But he really gives us a view of what's happening globally and kind of some of the lessons learned and best practices of what's happening globally. So Mark, wherever you are, if you could come to the stage. And lastly, guys, I'm a contracting guy at heart. And this is a true story. So when I was working at DHS, I found this international association. It was called the International Association of Contracts and Commercial Managers, largest association in the world focused on contracting. And I called the CEO and I left him a message. We'll see if he calls back. And he called me back. This is 5, 6, 7 years ago. And he called me back from a beach in Croatia. And he said he was working. I don't know. But they actually look at best practices from a supply chain perspective around the world, and they engage with universities in the EU, in Asia, in Australia, and in North America to actually help to promote the profession of supply chain management and contract management. And they've started to focus specifically on how these technologies can actually drive value in that profession. So I invited Tim to come, and he came, and we're honored to have you, Tim. So, before we get started, guys, I just want to point out one thing that's really important while they might come up. We're going to talk a lot about systems today. We're going to talk a lot about the data layer. We're going to talk about building capabilities off the data layer. But let's not forget the humanity in this. And Hillary and Tiffany kind of touched on it. And I told this story at the Acquisition Excellence Conference, and I will share it again. When I realized the power of blockchain technology, I was actually walking out of a movie theater in Latin America, in La Paz, Bolivia, and I heard this kid screaming. And I have 2 kids, so you immediately turn your head when you hear a kid scream, 5, 6 years old. And I walked over to him and I asked him why he was crying. And someone had given him popcorn on the way out of the theater, and an older kid took it. And I was like, well, where is your parents? And my wife was kind of like elbowing me, and it's like, he's homeless. Like he's being taken care of by another homeless individual. And you start to realize, like, he'll never have identity. He'll never have a bank account. He'll never be able to buy anything if he does make money and save it in some form or fashion. Like it is a group of people that do not have identity. With blockchain, you can do an ear scan, you can do a thumbprint scan, you can create an identity at a very low cost for that individual. And there's economic vitality in that. And off of that data layer, you can run a credit check, you can create a bank account, you may be able to buy something and prove that you own it. Somebody can't take it to you by just ripping up the deed at the office that holds the deed. And so don't forget, when we talk about how to implement it in the technology, the impact it can actually have on humanity. because that's why we're all here. All right, that's the value proposition. That's what's so important to me. So with that, I'd like to start with the individual that actually gave me the idea of the data layer. Tony, you've worked across government. You've seen all the challenges that we face in government, and you've now kind of been in the private sector. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges in government, some of the things you advocated for while you were in government, and how you think this technology can help us get to what you advocated for, and then what you're seeing in the private sector.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me today, and thanks to ACT-IAC for sponsoring this forum. First of all, I was pleased to see the MGT Act got not only passed, but got funded. I wanted to start there because the idea behind a lot of that was to have at least some central pool of money that could be used for cross-government purposes. And in thinking about the potential benefits for blockchain, in today's forum, I thought I wanted to start there because, well, I think there could be, tens of thousands, if not more, really interesting use cases for blockchain in the federal government. Probably the wrong thing to do would be for there to be 10,000 or more individual, siloed, narrow implementations of the technology. The real benefit of this, I think, is in common use across multiple agencies around, common needs that agencies have. So things like identity and data sharing and what have you seem to me to be great places to start. And I want to just share a thought that maybe could be a ignition point for making this happen. The U.S. federal government, for example, could declare certain things as common use utilities. Think of public airways that the FCC regulates today. Why not have an auction and say, who wants to bid on and own blockchain for identity or blockchain for some other set of common uses, electronic health records and so on, and license or auction off that space, that use case, to companies that are willing to invest in, it could be private sector companies, but willing to invest in the technology, the platform, the common layer that multiple agencies could take advantage of. Just as one example of how you could maybe mobilize this. My fear is that with all the enthusiasm around blockchain, what we'll get is 10 or 20,000 very unique, very siloed, non-shareable solutions. And while it may make things more efficient in some sort of siloed way, my fear is that it would fail to take advantage of what I think are some of the better properties of blockchain technology. So that's kind of, a starting point for me. By analogy, you can look at, and this is, I think, where our conversation started, well-planned communities where they decide that we're going to underground all the utilities. We're going to have a common system for managing, water and sewage and electricity and all the rest of it. And that underlying framework is put in place, and then you build the community on top of that. And these end up being wonderful places to live and lower cost, own and operate and so on. And we've all seen what happens when the opposite happens, when there's a lack of planning or a lack of architecture or a lack of figuring out what the next 2 or 3 steps are going to look like before you leap off and go do something. So my plea is for some degree, and it starts with conversation, and it starts with the kind of work that ACT-IAC does, some degree of planning and thoughtful sort of direction, but also enabling framework that would allow some of this utility value of blockchain to really flourish and reach its full potential.
Thank you. So Mark, you're an implementer. And Tony touched on a number of things there, and I just want to kind of pull on a couple threads. Talk to us a little bit about kind of the lessons that you've learned, and you don't have to be specific, through different implementations that you've kind of engaged in. And then the interoperability question, if you could kind of dive into that a little and talk to us a little bit about how you could see us thinking about creating something that ensured interoperability, so we didn't run into an issue of 20,000 different kind of projects being implemented across government.
Yeah, it's interesting. The idea of, if I plan utility functions, and it runs at 110, right? It's 60 hertz, 110. Nobody's going to argue that.
Sure.
Funny, though, we go back far enough and there were arguments around that.
That's right.
Manufacturers had chief electricity officers, right, or engineers whose job was to actually generate the electricity, and there was quite a lot. And of course, the direct current versus alternating current debate, which was pretty dramatic and pretty open.
And we're heading back to DC in some cases.
The direct current, not District of Columbia, just for those that care. So, Jose, when we look at implementation now, we're at a good place. Jackie at Gartner has the hype curve, right? And clearly people think we're teetering at the top of the hype, headed into that trough of disillusionment. And the function of that is coming in large part from implementation details. Some very visible experiments, and they were in fact explicitly experiments that tried the hypothesis, proved it in the small but didn't prove it in the large. That is, it did not scale. And in certain cases that was a technology element, and that the evolution of the technology right now is so high. I mean, we're at that place in the life cycle where you get literally 100 flowers blooming before we curate those back into gardens of sort of proven capability and trustability. Sometimes that challenge comes in the process element. So there's I think it's Federal Computer Week has an article about Treasury's experiment with the blockchain around tracking assets, particularly tracking mobile phones. And it turns out there was a lot of inefficiency along that, but they had to gather that forward to the front setup to cause the blockchain solution to work along the long term. So it was ultimately very productive, and they're very happy with the results of it, but the process factors were quite high. The third piece, and the hardest one to control, is the people part of it. And you may have thought I was going to say data, because Tony's sitting between us. I could have said data, but it's the people part of it. There are entrenched vested interests that have no desire to be disenfranchised or disintermediated, and those are resistant. There is this misunderstanding, perhaps, this question of who owns the blockchain, and that's you have to get your head sort of 7.5 degrees off of your normal on that, because I ask you the question, who owns the blockchain, and your answer would be no one owns the blockchain, right? The community or the ecosystem or the trading network, as Tim might reflect, the trading network owns the blockchain somewhat collectively. So there are some technology challenges, there's some process learnings that move where the work occurs, and then there are these sort of cultural adoption challenges. Interoperability is going to be the next layer. So we talked a couple of years ago in our technology trends report about blockchain, the mechanics of trust and how you use trust and lack thereof to facilitate or disintermediate. Then last year we talked about from blockchain to blockchains and the interoperability as we design more complex mission capabilities or business processes to leverage the capabilities of these distributed consensus ledgers. So you hear that? I didn't say blockchain, I didn't even say digital ledger technology, because it's not. It is sort of, who cares? It's distributed consensus ledger approach to design. And so, the other part of that is that we had a direct analogy that's recently obvious in the federal marketplace, both to industry and to the government, which is cloud. We spent a lot of years talking about how do I use the cloud, and what I meant was me and one cloud service provider. And where we are now is we know very clearly that the more complex the business piece, the more complex the mission, it's not a cloud service provider, it's multiple cloud service providers. And now we're dealing with the idea that it's not just me to cloud A, and me to cloud B, and me to cloud C, but clouds A, B, and C need to talk with each other on my behalf, not necessarily at my behest. I want them to do it without me having to tell them. So we track forward and look at where blockchain is going. We believe it's going to be an element of both designing and realizing great efficiency and even disruption in mission process, business process. We believe we're going to sort of the me to a blockchain, and then we're going to go me to blockchain A, me to blockchain B, me to blockchain C as I get more complex in my designs. But ultimately, I need the chains themselves, those ecosystems or trading networks to talk together on our behalf.
Thank you. Very interesting. So Tim, we started off with a very interesting discussion. You have a global view. You're able to see what's happening kind of around the world. So why don't you give us your thoughts as you listen to this discussion? I know trading networks are something that are you're very passionate about and have always been passionate about. What are you seeing on a global scale that you could kind of share with us that we may not always have exposure to as it relates to this technology and how government and industry are looking to leverage it?
Confusion, in a word. I think there is tremendous interest, and some obviously welcoming the potential that this brings, and others, as you rightly say, Mark, threatened by it and resistant to it. So I absolutely endorse the two sets of comments there have been. Jose, as you know, our interest as an association is in the quality and integrity of trading relationships. And why do we care about that so much? Because quite simply, if you think about it, trade is a concept that is unique to the human species. It is actually the uniting force. Of course, there are times it can also be a dividing force, as we're seeing at the moment, the challenges, the threats that arise if there isn't confidence in the fairness and the integrity of the underlying system. So this is important stuff, and it lies at the heart of economic wealth and growth and human prosperity. Blockchain gives us the opportunity to start thinking about all of this in new and different ways and building new forms of integrity into the system, generating an environment of greater reliability and trust. I was thinking in the curious way that I do, Jose, being a student of history, as I came in here and I was looking at all the past presidents and coming into the freedom room or the constitution room or the get rid of the British room, I can't remember what it was called. But, I was thinking to myself, gosh, wouldn't it have been interesting if we'd had blockchain at the time of the Revolutionary Wars? What chaos that would have created in terms of ownership rights. But the point is that blockchain is going to give us a platform of greater trust and reliability and confidence for that kid in Bolivia, right the way through, obviously, to the way that we trade with each other. I think blockchain, of course, is in itself just a platform. And what will give it its worth, its purpose, will be the quality of the data feeds and the fact that it can sit above other systems which today are very disconnected and which actually create tremendous levels of cost and delay and complexity. So the wonderful thing I think that blockchain can begin to do for us is the aggregation of data from a multitude of different systems. Obviously, you can probably guess that I have quite a lot of interest in topics like Brexit. Think about Brexit and think about the context of the challenge of Ireland and the customs union. Well, obviously things like Brexit start to become potentially a solution to that differential of trading activity between the EU and the UK. The opportunity, obviously, to streamline many of those procedures. So we are seeing that level of excitement. We've just, as Jose knows, completed a large study for the Canadian government looking at global benchmarks of public sector attitudes towards technology and contracting of the future. And blockchain begins to create a new set of challenges, as Mark said. One example of that would be, if we're going to standardize around blockchain, why don't we standardize around a lot of the contract forms and contract terms? Why don't we use these new technologies that are emerging, blockchain, AI, NLP, etc., to really democratize the way we go about doing trade, truly creating opportunity for small businesses to operate across traditional global boundaries that actually are just there because of the limitations of past culture and past imagination. So I find this whole thing a truly sort of liberating experience in terms of the way that we can start rethinking our world.
When I walked in, I didn't get a chance to say hello to you, George, but how are you? George Peterson said hi to me, and we worked on something called the TTech Infrastructure Modernization together. And I know George is sitting back there, and he's like, you know, we spent a lot of money to move from a bunch of different systems to one system. So how, is it possible to actually interact with the existing network of systems and slowly kind of roll into a blockchain-enabled environment? Or do I need to go to Congress and do I need to ask Tiffany and Hillary for $200 million to actually move to a new environment? So it's an open question to anyone that wants to take that, but I mean, is this a big ask? Is there flexibility to interact with existing systems and kind of peel one business process off at a time? Or do I need to ask for a boatload of money and recreate whatever I'm delivering in a new environment?
Well, if Tiffany and Hillary can get you $200 million, take it.
Yeah, that's
But I think the answer is in the question, Jose, and the couple of things. So Tim's point is an interesting one, that the initial use cases were envisioned as sort of implementations of blockchain for record keeping, implementations of blockchain for value exchange, implementations of blockchain for contract automation, and getting that intermediary that was the digital intermediary as opposed to some other trustee. The cause that you mentioned and the one that you bring forward is this idea of, well, can I use it as a lightweight data integration layer from the top down? Data-driven integration, so we're good with that. I mean, we really like data-driven integration. We understand it. And it is very lightweight. And I can because it allows me to take otherwise untrusted parties and bring them together in transaction. That's what it does. So I'm taking these otherwise unintegrated systems and bringing them together around data-driven transactions. So I believe it is absolutely a way to build an on-ramp or off-ramp, whichever the right direction would be, from multiple siloed, repetitive, redundant, and inefficient to more singular, common, or orchestrated future. In addition to that, somebody said robotic process automation as another way to bridge that. So not only can I use the blockchain as the data integration layer, but I can use the scripting automation of RPA to get that, the fact that a clerk has to work on 3 different systems in order to get a task done. And those data themselves could be then persisted and perpetuated through the chain.
And do you see that happening at all anywhere, Tony, as you ponder that question?
Well, I see conversation. I don't see so much implementation yet. And I think largely it's because the sort of blueprint or the way forward hasn't been fully articulated in some sense. But here, let your imagination roll for a second and say, and you were involved in getting Schedule 70 stuff done, right? Government-wide, right? Pick something, pick anything that's common need across the federal government and have GSA do it. Use smart contract technology built into blockchain to make it super simple for agencies to leverage blockchain. And they don't even, in most cases, have to know it's blockchain underneath But if they have the ability to do something that they need to do and want to do, and there's a way to make it easy, I think everybody will jump on board and say, hey, let's do that, you know? And so I think it's, the solution I see is usually some sort of combination of top-down sort of broad strategy and direction, along with some implementation framework, and then enabling the bottoms-up stuff to sort of feed into that ecosystem. And I'll just give you one example from my private sector experience about how this worked. When I was at the Walt Disney Company, we had a bunch of big divisions. We had the movie business, we had the theme park business, we had consumer products, we had ABC television, ESPN. There was little that these big divisions had in common, except they all had common customers. And when the Can-Spam Act came along, all of a sudden there was this big scramble. And the basics behind the law were that if you were being sent digital offers by anybody in the company, the customer had the, by law, the ability to opt out and say, I don't want any more digital advertising from the Walt Disney Company. So it meant that something that ESPN was sending out or consumer products was sending out, if the customer opted out, it had to be shared among all the other divisions. Now, prior to this, there was no reason for any of these individual parts of the company to share their customer information, except where it was in their mutual interest. Now, by law, there was a requirement that this happen. And it sparked a great discussion in the company about who owns the customer, who owns customer data, how do we share it? Sound familiar to GDPR and some of the other questions that we had today? But the result of that discussion was internally within the company, some clear decisions that we made about who owns the customer and who doesn't, and how it's shared and so on. And we implemented a common framework that still left the individual divisions of the company do the things that they needed to do with respect to their customers, but still allow us to comply with the law. And it was a simple top-down but bottoms-up sort of feature. And I've thought about that experience a whole bunch of times as I think about some of these larger problems that we have. And in this case, it was a response to U.S. law forcing us to deal with something that, frankly, I think we would have had to deal with eventually anyhow. But it caused this company-wide, really intense discussion to take place, and ultimately for us to make some decisions that enabled the whole ecosystem to work. And so I think we've got to have that debate. We've got to have the discussion and say, what is in our common interest? What's in our common implementation? What are the broad frameworks and parameters? And kind of lay that out and debate it a bit, and then having agreed on it, then go implement.
And I'm going to open it up to questions, guys, but as you guys are preparing your questions, and you raise your hand, just want to go to Tim really quick. And Tim, you mentioned the Canadian government, and you kind of heard Tony and Mark talk about this. Are they doing anything different from the perspective of trying to implement change from your perspective and in terms of how you're supporting them than we are? And is it a best practice that we could learn from, or would you be willing to share? I put him on the spot.
Yes, an interesting question. No. Yes, willing to share, but no, nothing that you would immediately learn from. I think, Canada is interesting. They went through, of course, a number of corruption crises, as many of you may be aware of, some years ago. And as a result, as with many organizations, public and private sector, when they go through a sort of crisis of confidence like that, they build in all sorts of controls. Compliance becomes the order of the day. And of course, compliance historically has been based very much around human intervention. So it's otherwise known as incredible bureaucracy. So they have managed to introduce perhaps a system that inevitably went a little bit over the top and has actually stifled innovation, has stifled the ability to respond to the very dynamic forces that are impacting our economies globally. So their interest is absolutely now in terms of how do we emerge into a new and better world. And I think their perception of blockchain and other technologies is that this can really create a very different approach to the way that compliance is overseen. Very much the same vision, I think, as is occurring in the financial services sector, where we all understand why regulation has gone the way it is, but if we're not careful, we're just going to kill industries. We have to be thoughtful about this balance of regulation and the ability of organizations to deal with it, and the human, the cost again to humanity of putting those controls in place. GDPR being one wonderful example of that.
Exactly.
And I think this is again where the technology piece is now exciting people. Probably, Jose, in terms of where are the most advanced developments of it? Well, actually, in Asia. Countries like Singapore, of the benchmark work we did, the ones that we were most excited by were South Korea and Japan. And very happy to share with anybody who wants to know more detail about what they're up to, but certainly I think once again, it's the attitude to risk in Asia that's so different. Risk is something that's seen as exciting and welcome because it's an opportunity. And I think that's where, of course, their attitude then towards technology is things that can really enable them to take on more risk and to do things differently is overwhelming.
Fascinating. So guys, do we have any questions from the audience, please?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about the promise and potential of these technologies, AI, blockchain, et cetera. But as we all know, there's always a dark side to technology and the negative implications. So I wanted to understand your perception of the potential negative implications, especially with the right to be forgotten, the potential for people to now more easily have access to manipulate or put data that shouldn't be in public eyes in a permanent immutable ledger, and how regulation, maybe it's inevitable, but how regulation could try to prevent something like that.
I'm happy to start if you want. So I'm a student of several big technology revolutions in my lifetime, and that's what happens with age. You get to see these patterns over and over and over again. And I think we talked about the hype cycle a little bit. Whenever there's a hype cycle like this, there's the inevitable abuse and misuse of technology and even some things masquerading as that new technology that really aren't. They're just frauds and scams and other kinds of things. And so I think there's an important role for regulation, but there's an even more important role for education.
There you go.
And I think it's through forums like this, but we've got to just do a better job, period, about educating people. The securities laws changed in the 1930s after there was massive abuse of, stock, manipulation and fraud and people taking money for things that they should never have taken money for. And that framework in 1933 has served us pretty well for, a long time with some updates and changes and so on. I think it's time for us to think about, the digital version of that, and what does that really look like? What are the broad rules that ought to apply to this more digital economy that we're living in. Because all of that framework that was done was an analog framework meant for a world that, quickly is moving on to other places. And again, I think this is a case where we've got to have the public debate and say, what's in the public interest here? And I think that discussion is starting. What would be bad, and this is where the 1933 laws were great, is it applied broadly, not only to the U.S., but it set a standard globally for how you regulate what had been a very, sort of big problem at that time. And I think the U.S. has the ability to get in there and establish this sort of new rules for the digital era, blockchain being an important part of this. But as was mentioned, there's other places in the world that really want to do the same thing. And so you're seeing announcements come out of Asia, out of Europe, and so on, to try to get out in front and really be the trendsetter or the pattern setter, and we've just got to get engaged. And I think to a large degree more than we are today.
Anyone else?
While we get the next person in. So there is again, 7.5 degree shift, right? But one of the tenets of exchange on a blockchain is it can be person to person, and I do not need an intermediary to generate trust or to clear transactions, et cetera. And so some of the habits of government, which are to regulate at points of intermediation, at points of brokerage or control, are not going to work. And so I hope that in fear we don't overgrasp to close down by regulation or legislation or other policy means to close down the networks that can and should grow and experiment. Having said that, along with the sort of protection and freedom goes some responsibility. Caveat emptor, you cannot be an idiot, right? Well, I guess you can, but you shouldn't be an idiot. And truly buyer beware. And so the good side of that is I didn't buy Bitcoin at $90 a coin, which was really stupid when it was $1,000 a coin, and incredibly idiotic when it was at $20,000 a coin. It's still pretty stupid, but I didn't do it. On the other hand, there are people that have entered into blockchain contracts without really understanding. They've entered into a contract without understanding the mechanism of enforcement or the terms of contract. And they've gotten burned by it. Well, I guess I'm a little bit of a free markets guy. That was your choice. You weren't careful. You got burned. There it is. I don't want us to see that to clench down. I don't want to see the fear cause a clench reaction that will limit the ability for experimentation to occur, and then those things that are important and valuable to grow and so.
Good morning, Jose Nino. The last 10 years we've had iPhones, cloud, cybersecurity. People are talking about AI and even Bitcoins. In the middle of all this, blockchain shows up as the new buzzword. And you have all kinds of platforms out there that claim to be blockchain. All of these are all new disruptors in the economy. As blockchain comes in, what is going to be the biggest impact as a disruptor to industry and government, and where is it going to meet to find a space where it can work together? Because right now, all we know is that blockchain's behind the curtain, but is it behind curtain number 1, number 2, and number 3?
So I'll kind of start, and these guys certainly know more than I do, but what interests me about blockchain isn't really what it does, it's the agility that it gives you. And so, meaning I can layer it over my existing systems, and I can use it as a repository to create a data layer, and then I can build microservices to add value off the data layer. And now I don't have to change 6 applications and run IV&V on 6 applications to ensure that it works together. So what I really like about it is that it gives me flexibility. So when you talk about, when you have your question about the intersection of all these different technologies and where does it end up, I don't know where it ends up, but I want to create as much agility as possible to deliver an outcome to a specific user. And blockchain as a technology gives me that flexibility to interact with the old and leverage the old for what it's worth, but would be really flexible for the new. And to me, that's why I've become so passionate about using it. And that's, my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Jose. I think obviously the work you did was a great example of that need for new and different thinking. There are many activities that we undertake today within the business world and the government sector which are relatively disaggregated, where the communication lines are not clear-cut, where certainly the myriad of systems that don't talk to each other. You gave a great example with ESPN and Disney and so on. My career included a period at IBM at the beginnings of globalization, when IBM was organized as a series of disaggregated product divisions and country entities that didn't speak to each other, couldn't exchange information with each other. And if we had blockchain then, how much simpler re-engineering would have been, because it would have been that potential to overlay and upload the data from the different countries in a way that just wasn't possible. We had to rip out the whole thing and start again, which of course, for those of you who remember, was almost the destruction of IBM. So I think you're absolutely right. The excitement here is the agility that it can bring us.
Tim worked at IBM for a while. And Tony, Mark, anything you want to add while we find our next question?
But I think that the world is full of examples of great protocols that have been broadly leveraged. And if we think about blockchain as one of those that could be leveraged broadly, I think your head is in the right space. You think of the TCP/IP protocol, that gave us the internet. Pretty great sort of thing, right? Worked pretty well. Think of ATM networks, the fact that you can go to any ATM anywhere in the world and get your money, pretty cool thing. Those are examples of broad, widely adopted standards. And I'm not a big fan of over-regulation. I don't want to make it sound like I want to sort of regulate everything. But I think there has to be a place where the discussion around the protocol and the network and the standards take place that then allow everybody to jump on that and take advantage of it. And again, my fear is, 20,000 siloed, non-communicative, non-collaborative implementations of a great technology probably would be my nightmare in some sense.
We're over here.
Right here. Good morning. I'm Karen Ward, and thank you for your bringing your experience and your knowledge today to this audience. Based on my experience in working with customers in the federal government, one of the things that seems to hamper the adoption of new technology is the acquisition process. And I think the woman who spoke earlier, Hillary, mentioned that procurement is a potential barrier. So what are some of the things that can be proactively done to assist the acquisition workforce in the acquisition process to enable them to readily adopt blockchain or to be more open to the adoption of blockchain?
Yeah, since I'm an acquisition guy, I will jump on that. I think that the key for us as we look at this technology, as well as machine learning and artificial intelligence in HHS, and if you haven't taken a look at the draft RFP, RFI for HHS that's out on the street now, you should take a look at it. I think the key for us is a robust dialogue with industry, and you've given me a wonderful opportunity to kind of tee up that at HHS, in order to educate our acquisition workforce more, we're bringing industry to us and asking them to explain what exists in the marketplace, the capability, how we may be able to value it. In fact, just stand up, Ali. So Ali Porgasami is going to be the industry liaison, similar to the role that I had at DHS. I picked him because of the hair. Nobody would ever, you always be able to find Ali. But he's going to be the industry liaison for HHS, and we're going to start coordinating activities where we bring in companies, NGOs, to actually talk to us about how this technology is being implemented, the things that you have to think about if you want to do an implementation of artificial intelligence or blockchain or machine learning, and some of the best practices that you guys are being exposed to both across the federal space and in the commercial sector. And to me, that's the key. So everybody make sure you grab Ali's ear. He doesn't have business cards yet because he literally just found out about this yesterday. So just be patient with him.
Well, I think you have the experience with Schedule 70. I'll use that as an example. Again, to say, let's go create some common thing that agencies can literally take advantage of right away without having to go do a bunch of individual work in every single agency and all of the discrete customizations that would go along with that. I mean, getting the federal government to do anything as a whole, as you know, is really hard, but there's some great examples of cases where that's been done, and so let's leverage those learnings and those examples and use that as a lubricant to the flywheel of getting stuff going.
I mean, I suppose some of the implementations that we're seeing are increasingly industry implementations, which will be music to your ears, certainly, because you're absolutely right. If this is all just fragmented activity, it does nothing really to raise efficiency, etc. But if you look at somewhere like financial services, the way that cross-industry